The Last of Us TV series does a number of things exceedingly well. For example, it handles important events in the story subtly, making it so that viewers can watch the series again on a second time and notice things that they haven't picked up the first time. For example, in the first episode where Joel and Sara almost eat but don't eat certain foods that were likely substrates that allowed the mutated Cordyceps to infect human beings.
Where's the pancake mix?
Oh, was that? Yeah, it was. Sorry.
I was gonna make you birthday pancakes. I swear.
It also does a spectacular job of depicting the psychological need to find something to survive for, and how this need is for the characters on the show just as important, if not more important, than finding the needs to survive physically. Whether it is the characters' hope for a cure, or love for another, or love for themselves, nearly every character presented in this series balances these traits of physical safety with emotional purpose. For example, Joel, even in his most cold and callous state, is never fully about his own physical survival, but his emotional needs and vulnerabilities are the reason for his cold exterior. There is something, though, that I noticed the series does exceedingly well on top of all this. That is, it spends a surprising amount of time and attention fleshing out the minds and stories of side characters. One of the clearest and best examples of this is the third episode named Long, Long Time. Now, I'll pause very briefly before continuing on to mention that while I'm going to try my best not to do major spoilers for the series, I will have some minor spoilers from here on out, so if you're okay with that, then let's get going, and if not, then get out of here.
Get the f*** out of here! What f***ing warm it up? Get out of here! Alright.
Let's first look at the screen time that each character gets in episode 3. The most screen time in this episode is given to the side characters Bill and Frank, who each get 30 minutes of screen time. While the main protagonists of the series, Joel and Ellie, come in a third and fourth with around 20 minutes each. Of course, looking over the entirety of Season 1, Ellie and Joel get the most attention since it's their stories the series is primarily focused on. But for Episode 3, as in our current example of focus, there's something I want to infer that's going on. The gist of what I think is going on here is that the storytelling of The Last of Us includes an emphasis on ephemeral characters. But why? Why put so much time and effort into fleshing out these characters that will be later discarded? Let's dive into that soon, but first let's go over some basic structures of this episode. The episode begins with Ellie and Joel hiking towards the home of Bill and Frank. During their journey, they pass the remains of the people killed by the government in the early days of the outbreak. The scene transitions to the past and shows how Bill, who is a doomsday prepper, survives the government atrocity and outbreak to fortify and create a defensible compound. Sometime later, Bill meets Frank, who falls into one of his traps. In order to avoid major spoilers, I'm just going to gloss over the rest of the episode. But I do want to emphasize that this is one of my favorite episodes, and it really does a great job of not pulling any punches when it comes to depicting the struggles and harmony that two people have in their lives. The important part is that at the end of the episode, Ellie and Joel find Bill's compound empty. And what I want to highlight here for the sake of discussion that Bill and Frank are gone. All Bill and Frank's story really meant to Joel and Ellie is that they obtained a car. That's it. They don't even take the guns that were on the wall.
Dude.
No.
There's a wall of them.
So to recap the story structure from the perspective of Joel and Ellie, they hike to a compound of someone that Joel knows. They talk about the early days of the outbreak and get to the compound and take a car and then leave. The episode ends with the two of them in a car listening to the cassette tape of Linda Ronstaff's song, which is the same name of the episode, Long, Long Time.
Oh, man.
It's better than nothing.
So given all this, the question remains, why? Why would any storyteller spend this amount of time on set of characters that ultimately they leave behind? I'd argue that this isn't something of a fault that the series is doing, and instead is actually intentional. It's intentionally pointing at a theme that I'll summarize as every mind is a world. For every mind that exists in a side character, a whole world of details of what they hope for and what they fear are created and exist, despite their side character roles. While we as viewers get presented with the pains and losses of Joel and Ellie and get to know what they hope for in the future and thusly are invested in the journey into their ends, it's not as if this phenomenon of hopes and fears exists solely with them. We often become so anchored in this specific world of Joel and Ellie that we forget throughout their lives and journey that they come into touch points with other minds, with other worlds. We also forget that their actions, while they try to obtain their hopes or avoid their fears, have intersected with other side characters' hopes and fears. Most of the time, stories, when they pay attention to these intersections, it's because they have become front and center of the main story's plot. For example, in episode 6, when Joel finally meets his brother Tommy, you see a very strong crossroad and collision. One between Joel's fears of being too weak to continue to protect Ellie versus Tommy's hopes of being near his partner and help protect her and their unborn child. But what is also done in the Last of Us series, as illustrated very well on the Long Time episode, is that the detailing of two side characters, Bill and Frank, whose intersections with Joel and Ellie can be very subtle and limited. It isn't necessarily a crucial part of the story either. For example, the plot could have continued on simply by having Joel and Ellie find a half-working car abandoned in some side of the road. But by paying this amount of attention to the story of two side characters whose lives are behind the car that is eventually given to Joel and Ellie, the series shows that even small objects and moments, a car left behind, a comic book discarded, etc., there are whole worlds and stories behind these small objects and moments. This is important and noteworthy because it complements what I take to be one of the main themes of The Last of Us, and that's moral ambiguity. For example, killing someone is bad, but what about killing someone to prevent others' deaths? Or what if you had to kill someone who was your entire world, a daughter, a son, a lover, etc., in order to protect or save others? The Last of Us story is centered around this moral ambiguity and highlights these situations so frequently that we can't ignore the immoral ambiguity of a topic that is meant to be centerfold. What emphasizing how everyone, even side characters, are carrying with them a set of hopes and fears, and how the consequences of our actions while pursuing our own hopes and running away from our own fears have downstream consequences that can't be seen, heightens the amount of moral ambiguity and uncertainty that our actions have. And I'd like to note too that while this whole YouTube video is focusing on episode 3, Long Time, it's not focusing on something that's an outlier either. There are episodes like this, like for example in episode 5, Endure and Survive, that have a similar pattern of side characters giving more screen time than main protagonists. Additionally, this concept that our actions have moral consequences to the others' worlds that we don't see is so crucially pertinent to the setup of The Last of Us Part 2. Once again, I'll avoid going into the details to avoid major spoilers, but if a single action that literally happens in the blink of the eye and then passes with little fanfare did not happen in The Last of Us Part 1, then the consequences of that small brief moment would not have set up the framework that the story of The Last of Us Part 2 takes place in. Lastly, one thing I want to briefly mention is how these themes can relate to us in everyday lives. It's easy to anchor our entire story of The Last of Us on Joel and Ellie, because they, so to speak, get main character privileges and we can stop caring about the worlds of side characters. This is similar to our own internal narratives. We live our own lives as main characters and thusly privilege ourselves over others. Perhaps this is just how the minds evolved over time, or maybe this is more of a cultural thing. But regardless of the reason, we can, because of this, privilege our own hopes and fears over others. By doing so, we can quickly forget that our own actions towards our hopes or away from our fears can either be helping or harming the worlds of others. So if you're the type of person who is open to The Last of Us Season 1 having a takeaway for our own lives, it might be just to pause or slow down or in general just chill for a moment.
Daddy, chill. What the hell is even that?
To think that while our own perspectives might trick us into believing the story we live in is only about our world, that there is a larger world composed and woven of smaller worlds that we bump and collide into, and that it might be helpful to think about how our own thread fits into this larger fabric. Even with the moral ambiguity this picture gives, the larger picture certainly is more interesting of a story than if it was just us alone. In a similar way, The Last of Us, by giving such detail for characters, by having every mind have a world of hopes and fears, even for those folks and minds that are side characters, we have a much more interesting story than we would have otherwise. All that being said, thanks for checking out this video. I appreciate you, and I hope to catch you next time. Bye bye.